Let's talk about my 2025 DR-Z4S. I guess you would call this another deep dive discussion video under the hood inspection. So I have taken off the radiator shrouds and the tank shroud. So let's first look at that. It is 3 pieces. You can take it off all in one piece. The reason I opted to do that is if we spin this around and look at the back here, right up there is a small screw that holds the radiator shroud to the tank shroud. So it's pretty much impossible to get to that without a lot of difficulty when this whole assembly is on the bike. So I just took it off all as one piece. So let's talk about how we get that off. So under the seat we have 2 bolts here. I just put those bolts in so I don't lose them. We do need to take out these 2 top bolts here and here, and what's interesting is there's these little tiny tabs that hold the radiator shroud to the tank. So if you do decide to take off the radiator shroud, be sure that you don't break those tabs off. And then we have a midpoint bolt right there, and then we have a lower bolt right there. So let's look at where those bolt up to. So the lower bolt goes in here to the radiator bracket, and there's a little nut plate on the fins, the little plastic fins. Then the midpoint bolt goes right here, and then the top bolt goes up here. So the top bolt holds the radiator shroud and the tank shroud to the tank. So you definitely have to take that out. And then those 2 other bolts where I showed that I have them sitting in the tank shroud, those thread in right here. So let's look at those bolts. So every bolt is different length and different design. So the very bottom bolt is the longest, and it has a little shoulder on it. The middle bolt, it's the same length, but it doesn't have a shoulder, but it does have an integrated washer on it, or flange. And then the very top bolt is a small one. So you definitely want to make sure that you get those bolts back in the right order, especially the short one in the top. Otherwise you're going to punch a hole in the tank. Back in the days of the original DR-Z, I remember people using the wrong bolt to attach the radiator shrouds to the tank if they had an aftermarket tank, and they would end up punching a hole right through their plastic aftermarket tank. So let's take a closer look under the tank here. So in one of my other videos I mentioned all of this ABS component built in above the radiator, sort of behind the radiator and below the tank. So you can see that is quite a menagerie of equipment. So of course that adds quite a bit of weight there. So you've got all kinds of brake lines going into that ABS module. So there's a closer look at the ignition coil. We have this little rubber piece here, and this is a lot of the reason why the tank is a lot smaller, is because you have this twin spar frame. So you've got this outrigger here on this side of the frame and another on the other side of the frame. So there was no room to extend the tank down outside of the frame because the frame is relatively wide out here. So initially I thought that this little rubber flapper seal was part of the tank shroud, but it's not. Once I got both of these top 2 bolts out that go right there, then the entire tank shroud, radiator shroud assembly lifted right off of that rubber seal, which surrounds the fuel tank opening. Of course, you do have to take the fuel cap off to lift that whole unit off. And we have another assortments of bolts here that I'll go over just a little bit. These 2 hold the side panel in place. Those are identical. They have a shoulder washer with a spacer. And then we have our seat bolt. That seat bolt is just a little bit longer. There's no washer or spacer on it, but it is a flanged bolt. So that bottom bolt for the side panel goes right here. That is hidden behind the black panel that covers up the airbox. So this panel sits right about like that. And then our top side panel bolt threads in, I believe, right there. That, I think, is where our seat strap was. You can see here how large that radiator fan is. It basically is almost the size of the radiator. So there's the top tank of the radiator. The fan is all the way up to the top of that. And down here, it's fairly close to the bottom of the radiator. Hopefully the aftermarket gets on board with these new bikes fairly quick and gets us some radiator protection. Over here we can see our coolant overflow tank. These zip ties right here, that's for the little hour meter that I added. What I'm planning on doing is relocating that hour meter slash tachometer. Hopefully it will fit right up here in that space. I'm just gonna have to pull it off and test it and see if it fits. I added some clear protectant here. It's not working out too good. It has kind of peeled off on the edges, so I'll probably just need to trim that off. Hopefully another aftermarket company will develop some frame protectors similar to what they have for other bikes like the Tenere 700. But Sherby's has some really nice ones for the Yamaha T7. Let's take a look up under the fender. So I'm working on taking this rear fender extension off to take a peek at the turn signal wiring. So I've taken out 2 bolts here. Then there's 2 bolts in those little recessed areas. Right there, and then there's 2 bolts, kind of hard to see, right there and there. Those are Allen head style bolts, and then there's a bolt there and one on the opposite side. So all of those bolts I have laid out here in the order in which they are installed, front to back. You can see they're all different lengths. Four of them are the same, but then these are the little Allen head. Those are relatively short, and then these are relatively short as well. So 6 of them use a 10mm socket. Those use a little Allen head style bit. A 5/32 Allen head bit fits those perfect. Buried up inside, I see 1 connector, but I see 2 wire harnesses. And then the other thing let's take a look at is I kind of tugged on this little piece and this came out. So that sort of goes up inside and protects a bunch of wiring. So let's get my light down here and take a closer look at that. That is where we can see our turn signal connectors right up there, and then also our license plate light. License plate light is the little white connector. Right turn is the black connector. Left turn is the little red connector. Take a closer look at the red connector. So you can see this little hole there. There's that little yellow spot. That little yellow spot is sort of a a little sleeve inside. So the hole right there is where this little clip plugs into. So to get that disconnected, I just pushed on that with my thumbnail and then pulled down on it. You just have to get it depressed far enough where it releases. And I'm actually mentioning a lot of details in this video because I'm working with a company to come out with an aftermarket set of turn signals for this bike. So that little wire harness is about 3 inches long from the body of the fender right there. Let's talk a little bit about reinstalling that inner fender piece as well as the rear fender extension. So we've got 2 bolts there, we have 2 bolts up there, those little Allen head bolts right there, and then we have one here and one over there. So if you get those 2 bolts in, then those 2 and those 2 may not line up. So what I did is struggled with this for a while and then realized I needed to loosen those 2 bolts because I put those in first and tightened them up, and those 2 holes would not line up. So I loosened those 2, and that allowed this little inner fender piece to shift back and forth. So tighten those up last. And it's not a bad idea to install those first, but don't tighten them, because that is essentially what holds the inner fender to the main body of the fender extension. And then you can do those 2 and those 2. So those 2 being tight, I couldn't get those to line up. So once I loosened those 2, then the inner fender piece shifted back and forth a little bit, and then those 2 lined up. So let's point out something. So the rear inner fender piece has 2 little legs that attach there, and that bolt also goes through the main body. So there's shoulders on those bolts to allow for the thickness of the inner fender piece. So what I would do is tighten those down first and make sure that the leg is flush fit over the shoulder on those bolts. Then you can go ahead and tighten up those 2, and then the Allen head bolts last. When I reinstall the bolts, not just those ones that are talking about on the rear fender extension, but any others like the tank shroud, the radiator shroud, and all that stuff, is I am using some gel style blue thread lock. Front signals use a similar style connector, but we've got a longer wire harness. This does appear to be the same style connector. So on the right side of the bike we have a black connector, and over on the left side we have a red connector. I've kind of jammed my tape measure up there. It's come loose a little bit, but I did have it following the contour of the wire, and we're looking at it right around 7 inches from the bracket where the turn signal mounts to the end of the connector. The harness on the left side turn signal appears to be just a little bit longer. It looks like it's about 8 inches. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments below. I do read all the comments, and if there's any questions, I'll be sure to answer those.